One, two, three. Time for more film movements. This time we're going to be going over the 50s. Usual spiel. Watch film movements for historical, sometimes cultural value, film appreciation. There's a lot of cool stuff to be found. I think if you go through enough film movements, you'll find a particular style or director or what have you that you'll resonate with. And I think it's worth checking into just for the sake of finding something new, in addition to the other stuff, of course. So the first one, we're going to start with probably my favorite film movement, which is free cinema. It is a series, basically, of British documentary shorts. They were presented in several programs, basically, a few at a time. The film movement was fairly short. It was a limited number, I think 16 films that qualify. Free refers to, as it's called, the lack of propagandized intent or box office aspirations. And alongside with that, fewer industry expectations for the film. Essentially more freedom to portray something that the filmmakers intended. Some of these founders would go on to be big contributors in the British New Wave, which will come at the end of the video. And some of these founders included Lindsay Anderson, Carol Reich, Tony Richardson, and Lorenzo Mazzetti. Some notable works include Oh Dreamland, Momma Don't Allow, and Together. Here are a couple quotes from some of the creators of the movement. By the way, Lindsay Anderson, one of the main forces behind the movement, does not prefer to characterize it as a movement, but whatever, I'll do it anyway. Anderson stated that with a 16mm camera and minimal resources and no payment for your technicians, you cannot achieve very much in commercial terms. You cannot make a feature film, and your possibilities of experiment are severely limited. But you can use your eyes and your ears. You can give intentions. You can make poetry. And then here is a statement from their manifesto. These films were not made together, nor with the idea of showing them together. But when they came together, we felt they had an attitude in common. Implicit in this attitude is a belief in freedom, in the importance of people and the significance of the everyday. As filmmakers, we believe that no film can be too personal. The image speaks, sound amplifies and comments. Size is irrelevant. Perfection is not an aim. An attitude means a style, and a style means an attitude. So you can tell from Anderson and the manifesto's own words that simplicity and the fascination with everyday life and the beauty that can be found within it is a driving force behind this collection of films. And that works for me as well. The fact is that seeing people live life in such a simple, straightforward way depicted on camera, there's just something beautiful and empathetic and almost reassuring in a certain sense about it, about seeing life go on, about seeing the regular experiences of human people portrayed on screen in an empathetic and understandable sort of way. That just really fascinates me and I find extremely comforting. So that's why I love these films so much. And I will refer to Momma Don't Allow for some examples. Momma Don't Allow is one of probably 3 movies that I could internally make an argument for being the best movie I've seen. And I know it's going to be an odd choice because if you watch it, I wouldn't be surprised if the average person watching it, and by the Letterboxd rating, you can tell, not particularly high, perhaps not very impressive, definitely not very impressive. The film follows basically an evening at a jazz club. But more specifically, it follows several sort of main characters as they come in from their outside everyday jobs. Butchers and dentist assistants and cleaning ladies, for instance. And they come into this club. They join the sort of, socializing, the dancing, the general good times that are happening inside. And the film just depicts people coming together to enjoy something good in life. It's beautiful and it's joyous. The music is fantastic. It's just a perfect slice of life movie to me. I don't think you can get any better than this because it's just so simple. 100% of the focus is on the enjoyment of good things that are so common. And not only that, but I think it's also interesting that for part of the film, we see these presumably upper class people join into the scene for a little bit. And, they're clearly not the same as the sort of blue collar workers that mostly seem to inhabit the place. It seems to be a new experience for them, something fairly novel. Whereas you see a number of other people dancing, enthusiastically, we'll say, dancing enthusiastically, seemingly confident in themselves and what they're doing, like they've been here before. But these upper class people seem fairly new. But I think it is interesting how the film depicts kind of like the difference between how different people might experience leisure activities at the time, and the fact that they're not even rejected or anything like that. They're just regular people too, enjoying something good, just like everyone else. And all of that I think is wonderful. I love the way you see different people enjoying themselves in different, sometimes very silly ways. A couple of clips that I'm probably playing right now are just wonderful to me. Just watching people enjoy themselves organically without a care in the world. It's just beautiful. And I love this movie. I love this movement. This is great stuff. These are all short. Some of them run up to like 40 minutes, but Mama Don't Allow, for instance, is 22, I think. So easy to check out. If you got a chance, please do. Love this movement. Love this stuff. All right, now that I've spent way too much time on a documentary short movement, we'll go on to some feature films. Next is The Polish School. This is a group of Polish directors and writers, influenced, again, by Italian neorealism, much like so many movements we'll still get to. Their goal was to portray some of the complexity and history of Poland, primarily in World War II, but also kind of examining their national identity. These often relied on symbolism and allegory, and communicating social and political commentary. Some notable directors included Andrzej Wajda, Andrzej Munk, and Jerzy Kawalerowicz. I'll refer to Kanal for some examples of the style. Kanal is a very straightforward example of the style and the aims of the movement. Kanal depicts a specific escape attempt by a section of the Polish military from Nazi Germany, from the German army. It's interesting, actually. I noted while I was looking some stuff up for this that the script was actually written by a survivor of this actual movement. So I find that interesting as for, like authenticity, not just for authenticity of the events within the film, but sort of an authenticity of the emotions and ideas, being represented in terms of the people and their history. Found a quote from Michalek Boleslav regarding the commentary on the national identity of Poland within the film. Here we have a definite comment on Polish heroism, an implicit critique of Polishness, the lack of political and social common sense, the propensity for disproportionately high sacrifices. According to this line of thinking, national history was one long chain of foolhardiness. I thought that was kind of interesting that a possible aim was almost to demystify history in a certain sense, to try to bring a certain sense of rationality or an even-handed examination of the country's history. Even in a time, I wonder if, this was well received, because you would think post-World War II, your country, which had been so ravaged by Germany, might need a pick-me-up. Perhaps the idea of re-examining, your country's heroism or something might not be well received, but the filmmakers had things to say, and they were, willing to confront their history and perhaps their people's conception of themselves. Something interesting about Kanal is that it always keeps, or frequently keeps, the background in perspective. So you don't lose track of what the setting is, what the stakes are in a certain sense, because the bombed out buildings and the broken skylines are very frequently visible. There's not a whole ton of like shot reverse shot or anything like that. I mean, this still is early on in film history, relatively. So frequently people are talking and there's just backdrops of destruction in view. So you don't forget what's happening through that, through the film's visual style. There is some really wonderful lighting and just some fantastic work in the underground sewers. The shadows, the claustrophobia, it's all so good. The filmmakers apparently, in general for the Polish School, did a decent amount of experimentation with lighting, some more high contrast stuff, some camera work. And it really pays off beautifully when we're underground. This, to me, is a really interesting example of a film movement that contains not just film history, but also a little bit of cultural history in terms of, like I was saying earlier, like it's interesting to see people sort of examine their own identities as a country in real time, especially at a time where it seems so relevant given post-World War II and what they had just gone through. So would definitely be recommending checking this one out for additional historical context. Next, one of the big hitters, French New Wave, could be certainly argued as the most influential film movement, or most important, at the very least for the direction of modern cinema, because it did a lot for kind of opening up what was stylistically accepted in film. The French New Wave was concerned with sort of rejecting cinematic norms and trying to broaden the medium and the ways in which people would accept film. Much like Italian neorealism, free cinema, and ultimately the British New Wave, this movement started with a circle of critics, famously at Cahiers du Cinéma, a French magazine. This included people like François Truffaut and Jean-Luc Godard. Something this movement does is it helps establish the director as kind of like the singular force or the primary visionary behind a film, that the film is kind of a director's signature in a sense. You can see the influence of Italian neorealism in this film from some of the low-to-the-ground, minimalist sort of filmmaking. Breathless, as we'll get to, had a stated intent to be shot like a documentary, for example. Some other notable works, something like 400 Blows, also fairly minimal. Even what I would consider to be like the best shot in the movie is quite simple but powerful. Things are shot on location, like Italian neorealism. There's not a whole ton of extras or things like that generally. And again, it just goes to show the power of simplicity. Especially, I think, it goes beyond simplicity because, I'm just talking about Breathless right now. I'll just jump into talking about Breathless, I guess, before going into history for some reason. So, something with Breathless that's notable is, like I said, Godard's initial intent was to shoot it like a documentary. And it sort of is. It is shot very simply. The camera is very simple. The lighting, they're just shooting with what they had, basically. But at the same time, the overall effect, especially after the editing room, and I think the editing is the clearest sort of divergence from perhaps the norm, perhaps traditional French cinema at the time. The jump cuts are extremely notable. You'll probably see that brought up in any article or anything about it. The jump cuts are not only a divergence, but they're also kind of unexpected from what you would assume a movie shot like a documentary would look like. So the film is made simply, right? Like simple intentions, but I think it's very interesting, especially given that quote earlier from Lindsay Anderson about how limited you are if you've just got a 16mm camera. Well, I think something that French New Wave does to build on that is prove that with the simplest setup, you actually aren't that limited. You can make something creatively distinct because you have all of these different elements to work with, including just for the clearest example, the editing, to create something striking and unique out of perhaps a very simple and minimalist intention. So anyway, beyond Breathless specifically, there's plenty of French New Wave to choose from. It's kind of hard to narrow in on one specific conception of it because although Breathless may have been a breakout, stylistically striking hit, it was certainly not the first. The 400 Blows came out before it, which may have been the first French New Wave hit, chronologically. I don't know if it was, I can't remember if it was considered to be the first. I probably should have looked that up, but whatever. 400 Blows is great. That's François Truffaut, for context. Alain Resnais is also an extremely notable filmmaker. He directed something like Hiroshima Mon Amour, which is probably his most recognized film, at least. Agnes Varda, who directed something like Cleo from 5 to 7. Now that I've brought those two up, it's a good time to talk about the left bank versus the right bank, which are two sort of aspects of the same movement. Left bank was people like Resnais and Varda. Right bank was more the people, the actual critics like Truffaut and Godard. The distinction seems to generally be the style and influences behind them, as the left bank, I believe, was named for the certain region that they lived in, a more commune of artist type of deal, very bohemian lifestyles for them. And they tended to have non-cinematic inspirations. I believe Resnais was primarily influenced by art, Varda by photography, and of course Truffaut and Godard influenced primarily by cinema, as you can tell by the fact that they're critics at a cinematic magazine. And even though the names might imply that they're sort of like set at odds, like opposite each other, they didn't necessarily, they had different styles. Like, I think if you look at, especially like Hiroshima Mon Amour, and compare that to something like Breathless or even 400 Blows, which is a little calmer in a certain way, you can see there's like a stark difference in the way they're trying to get ideas across. And even though there are those differences, these filmmakers were often very close, especially Varda and Godard had a long-standing relationship, and complexities within that relationship. The movement's fascinating for the people behind them to read about. But yeah, despite the fact that these filmmakers had different ways of communicating things, they're still concerned with these central principles of innovating, moving the medium forward, and experimenting with what could be done with it. Last, not least, although I'll admit this is not a movement I'm heavily invested in, but the British New Wave. This took place basically about the same time as the French New Wave, late 50s, early 60s, centered around the lives and frustrations of working class Brits. This ties into the Angry Young Men. There was a group of playwrights and writers, screenwriters, I think, actually, not just writers. They also shared this sort of disillusionment with British society. Apparently, the idea of class Britain about this time was a little more rigid and frustrating, of course, to these people concerned with the society at the time, these filmmakers. Look Back in Anger, which is one of the notable films of the movement, was written by one of the Angry Young Men before being adapted into the feature film. It was written by John Osborne. Also ties into kitchen sink dramas, which, as far as I can tell, really aren't actually that different, but there may be some kind of nuance to it that I'm not aware of. But if you hear of kitchen sink dramas, you can think British New Wave. The French New Wave was reportedly a large inspiration. Kind of confused by that. I haven't seen like a ton of this movement overall. I mean, not just the fact that it takes place at almost the exact same time, like Look Back in Anger was 1959, I believe, which means the play would have been written before that, which is like about the start of the French New Wave to begin with, but maybe subsequent works are more influenced by it. But also, it feels to me like the delivery is significantly different. Maybe not significantly, but the British New Wave certainly has an edge to it. That's not to say that the French New Wave does not have an edge in its own way, but the British New Wave is very focused and direct, I think, in my limited experience, in what it's trying to communicate, and it very much has an attitude to it. As I mentioned, there is overlap between this and free cinema. Lindsay Anderson directed The Sporting Life, Tony Richardson directed Look Back in Anger, and Carol Reich did Saturday Night and Sunday Morning. I'm not going to show any examples from this one because I don't know necessarily what I would point out specifically. Look Back in Anger, I think, is the easiest example to point to, so I'll check that out. I also do love Lindsay Anderson, mostly due to his free cinema stuff, but he's also got some other interesting work, so check out The Sporting Life. Check out that as well, just because Lindsay Anderson is great. Watch Oh Lucky Man, watch If, watch any of his stuff. So that's about it for the 50s. Next time will be the 60s, and the 60s is pretty stacked, which will feature probably my second favorite film movement. So I'm looking forward to that because I'm going to spend much too long talking about that one because there's so much to get through with whatever film movement that might be. Well, that's it. Thanks for watching. See you on the next one.